Greetings, citizen. Welcome to the show, and thank you for listening. For more of the art of wargaming in your life, definitely check us out on Instagram and Facebook. If you'd like to support the show, we have a Patreon account where you can do just that for as little as $1 a month. What we can offer will expand as the show does. If you don't have extra funds but would still like to help us out, you can give us a like, share, or 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. Want to get in touch? Feel free to message us or hit up our email, artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you because we know the world is vast, with many different ideas on tactics and strategy that can be applied to the games we enjoy.
You're listening to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network.
On War. General Strategy.
Welcome to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network. I am Yaga Malark, and today's episode has to do with general strategy. Before we get into that, just a little something beforehand. TF and I have been playing this crusade of the Blood Angels against my Gene Stealer cult. And at the lower power level, when we were doing 25, I was doing exceptionally well. We've popped up to 50 power level at this point, and I am finding it to be a much more difficult game. It's interesting how the different levels, the point values, benefit different armies in different ways. And so the ways that I've been trying haven't been terrible. I haven't been necessarily losing by a large amount, but losing. I remember losing is losing. So I'm trying to figure out some tricks and ways to get around that. Maybe try some new things, considering that he seems to have figured out the tricks I had. It's time for me to evolve. Time for me to pick up some new ones. So that's a challenge I'm looking forward to, as normal. The only other thing that I suppose I have to talk about is that I'm back with my students. And I'm absolutely enthused about that. I love volunteering with this program. I love these students. I love what it represents, and I love the quality people that it has brought to the community. You know, again, I've lost track at this point, which is nice. That's a good that's a good problem to have, because it means that a program is succeeding and that there are folks who are being reached by it. So I am happy to be a part of that experience and absolutely thrilled to be in a place where my extremely nerdy 20 years worth of fighting knowledge actually comes in handy. You know, most people on the street don't want to talk about that. I'm like, hey, you guys want to talk about the perfect way to throw a kidney wrap? And they look at you weird. You know, you're in the line at the bank and you're like, hey, so high crosses, right? Yeah, nobody gets it. Anyways, so it's nice. It's nice to be in a place where one's skills are useful. So, and originally, when we started this podcast, it was supposed to be an extension of the Officers Academy that I was running for said program. So, we have come a long way, but the mission of the show remains the same: to teach and to examine old texts from a new point of view to help with the games that we enjoy. Well, I don't have a whole lot else to talk about this intro, so let's jump right into dealing with concepts that are simple but not easy. The central theme of today's episode is largely the same theme as the show itself has overall. And it's the idea that things in war, things within military science, are often very simple, but they're not easy. And that's going to be kind of what we're examining today throughout the course of this episode. But let's begin this new section, which is the second book, air quotations, of this overall a book, not air quotations. I'm not sure why I used the air quotation tone. So he starts this one off, and of course he's going to be using various references to the last section. That's part of the reason why he laid the groundwork last time around, was to be able to come back and talk about it when it was relevant. But for this section, he's defining strategy as the employment of the battle as the means toward the attainment of the object of the war. Right? That's our That's our strategy. And the strategy itself has less to do with the battle itself and more to do with the forces themselves and the preparation. Remember that whatever we want to accomplish, we have to make sure that we have the means to do so, right? We had talked about that last time, making sure that whatever goal we were going to accomplish was realistic. We need to organize those means, though. Just because we have an excellent army doesn't mean much. I mean that we have an excellent army. You know, somebody can play the custodies, but if they play exceptionally poorly, they don't know how to use those custodies, it doesn't matter that they use one of the best armies within the entirety of of 40K, you know? Or at least it is at the time of this recording. I can't imagine they'd be bad at any point. So that has less to do with the force, the game itself, and more what you know. And of course, when you're dealing with something like gene stealers or things that are more niche, more high risk, this is even more important. The preparation, the planning that comes in beforehand. And this is before the battle is even joined. This is the overall plan for the different campaigns and the regulation of combat. In whatever case that may be, whether it's a series of fights on a particular day or just the one fight or one match, we have a goal. It's usually to win. But there's an overall goal that we use this to get towards. And so strategy is how we do that. Strategy, of course, like he says, is the process by which we work towards our object. Because the war itself is not the object. You know, some of us play the game just for fun, and that's something different. But in the case of war is for a reason. It takes a reason to get people motivated to do so. There's a lot that goes into war that isn't just math. And that's something that we've absolutely seen. You know, last episode we were talking about how in revolutionary France, the reforms were so ill received in the rural regions that it led to a full-fledged counter-revolution. Right? And so that was something that it wasn't about the numbers and calculation. That was something unpredicted. Something that didn't go according to plan. So, but we need to have our strategy, is what we're kind of working towards. And we base our strategy based off of theory. And the theory that we're discussing is the theory that we've learned about in previous chapters. We don't want to rehash all of the highly technical speak that Clausewitz went into in this last section. But it influences how the strategy is carried out. You know, obviously, whatever theory we're working with is kind of where we take our framework from. Whether it be if we're coming from a tradition like an ancient Chinese, like a Min tradition, or a mid 15th century France tradition, they're going to be different theories that are based on different realities. And any good theory, regardless of time or place, has to strive toward being the most efficient, really. Like, that's what we're going towards. And that's not too little and not too much, right? That's what efficient means. Because we have too little, we've dedicated too little, we're probably not going to achieve the object of our action. If we dedicate too much, then we are wasting. You know, that effort, that energy could have been spent elsewhere. And so this is one of the toughest parts of leading, or of playing any sort of wargaming, is trying to find this balance right here. You know, in this section, Clausewitz is saying that to understand these things, to really get into this, the reason that Frederick the Great was great is because he understood this. He was working with a small force, limited resources. And so doing just the right amount of effort was very important. And any of these theories are, of course, judged by the final result. We can have something that looks amazing, brilliant on paper. It might seem to answer for every viable option on the field. It could be a work of masterpiece, but if the results aren't there, then it really doesn't matter. All the best effort in the world, all of the best ideas on paper, if they don't produce the desired result in the field, are just a fantasy. You know, because Bellegarth and similar things are technically LARPs, Occasionally you have people come out and their whole character is based around the idea of being some sort of awesome. They've been slaying people forever, or whatever the case may be, and they give themselves skills just coming into it. And that's all fine and dandy. You can call yourself the Dark Lord of Shamadinana, who has slain, whole mountains in one flash of your golden sword of Abacus, or whatever. But unless you can actually do that on the field, nobody cares. Nice theory. Nobody cares. Still fun, but still, you understand what I'm saying. And so when we're looking at strategy, when we're looking at the means that we need to do so and the forms that work the best, it's very simple. And this is something else that Clausewitz was talking about in this section. He's like, anybody who says that this stuff is convoluted or that it's difficult to understand is overcomplicating things. Because it doesn't take an absolute genius to go, the oblique is awesome. If we get the localized numeric superiority, like rolling up the one flank, destabilizing our enemy and making it so that they have to be on the back foot and constantly repositioning, awesome. Really good technique, but it doesn't take somebody who's super brilliant to grasp it. And in fact, if it was that easy, if it was just about studying these simple techniques, the phalanx, the blitzkrieg, whatever techniques were awesome, if that was all it took, then a school child could do this. Generals, hang up your stirrups. Go and sit down. We got the kindergartners on this case. But it's not just understanding these forms and means of strategy, which are easily learned. It's these moral forces, the moral forces once again coming into effect. And these things also come into effect when we deal with wargaming in a very big way. But when we're dealing with actually making this strategy work, it is easy, or it's simple, but it is really not easy. But to make it happen, it requires a great strength of character, right? Integrity, believing in oneself, that boldness, that confidence that it takes to command an army. In history's case, but the confidence to go on the field or step up to the match knowing that you know what you're doing. The next is great clarity of thought or perception, being able to see what is going on through the fog of war, being able to see the surest path to victory. And then lastly, we need steadiness of mind, not going on tilt when we are goaded or when we lose something, but instead repositioning and rethinking our strategy in order to continue moving towards victory without stepping in our own way with emotions. Now, some of us can do one, maybe two of these very well. Some people have very good integrity and confidence in themselves. But maybe that leads to a bit of pride, and that means that their steadiness of mind is off. They're easily brought out by that pride. Or let's say that somebody has very clear perception. They can see what to do. They have a very clear vision of how to achieve victory. But perhaps not the physical prowess or the strength of presence to push it forward, or the integrity to really hold it together, or that steadiness of mind that it takes when in the face of adversity. So having one, maybe two of these is pretty common. But having a commander that exemplifies all three, well, that is when you run into the greats. That's when you run into folks like Frederick the Great. And this is a section where Clausewitz really praises him. But again, it's not for stuff like the oblique. And he tells us, he says, don't praise these commanders, these great commanders, for what they do in the field. Anybody can flank. Anybody can get back there and disrupt a supply line. Anybody can spot a weakness in the enemy line and exploit it. Those things in of themselves are not brilliant, and they are not necessarily why we should look to these commanders for inspiration. The reasons that we should look to these commanders for inspiration is that they are able to bring all of that together and make it work. And they have these personal traits that we've talked about, and they're able to make this execution happen reliably. It's not enough to know. It's not enough to think that you can, Burnside. It's a matter of being able to move forward with it and put all of it together in such a way that it works. Frederick had a hard job. When he invaded Silencia, he had enemies on every side, and with a very much smaller force, and he made it work, partially because he knew how to use his means in an efficient way, right? Not too much, not too little, but also because he had the fortitude, just the sheer mental fortitude and strength of will to make it happen. And so this is necessary for us too. When we approach the board or when we approach the fight, we need these things as well. There's a strength of character that comes into it, to resisting being tired, to making sure that we're out there giving our best. That's a strength of character, especially on day 3, where we may be tired. We may be lacking in some ways. And so in this particular case, that strength of character will fill in the gaps. Great clarity is nice, knowing where the enemy line is weak, knowing who their strong players are, knowing who their weak players are. Well, these things are excellent. Being able to look across to your board and be able to see what you're dealing with. You got, okay, these are Necron Immortals right here, and I know their stats, or I've seen these before. That clarity of thought and perception, very important. And then, of course, there's steadiness of mind, which is just across the board, not going on tilt. Not letting your opponent mess with your state of mind, whether it be make you angry or shocked or whatever the case may be, but just keeping that steady hand. And this one is honestly the hardest. Many of us think that we have this kind of steadiness of mind until we are in a situation where we're under fire. Perhaps in a real way. Sometimes, like when the bullets are flying, that shows us how steady we are, and you really don't know. Just like if you watch on the side from fighting, you see people and they're out there, beating the crap out of each other, and you think, oh, okay, I could do that easily. That's very different than stepping onto the field and looking across at somebody who looks at you like they know what they're doing, like you're a piece of meat or something like that, and stepping against this person and knowing what you're up against, and especially if you lose once or twice, like a lot of times when you're teaching new people, they'll step in and they have this confidence, right? This boldness, and then you beat them, or I beat them because I'm kind of used to this. My Belagarth career is older than my students, so it's very typical for me to be able to win reliably against them, and I can understand how I can be intimidating. I try not to be, of course. I smile. I engage with people. I do everything I can to not be intimidating, but there's just something about a larger person on the field who knows what they're doing that is intimidating. And so the steadiness of mind comes into factor here as well. Can a person hold their own against somebody that they know that they're probably going to lose to? And there's a fear there to it. There's a fear to being hit just in the first place. There's a fear to losing. There's a lot of fear that goes into it. And we can learn steadiness of mind. It can also be a learned trait. But in the greats, you often just see it plain. Because they have to make the difficult happen. They have to make these simple ideas into the difficult execution. Like we're saying again, if we're dealing with simple mathematics, if we're dealing with simple concepts, obliques, frontal assaults, rear guard, the number of troops that we're going to need, the number of wagons that we're going to need to process or bring the food to them, and then out of shot, like all those numbers boiling up, that stuff is easy. If that was all we needed, then accountants would be the very greatest generals on the planet. But that's not all it takes. Because that's not all there is to war. And that's not all there is to what we do either with wargaming. Showing up with the right gear, showing up with a good crew, these are all good things. Showing up with a nice army that you're practiced with, very good things. They set you up in a good place. But the execution with it, actually using it to achieve what we want, well, that's where the skill comes from. And because it has to overcome the moral forces that might be tearing it down. And moral forces, like we've said before, are not something that we can usually account for in a battle plan moving forward. They're just not. We can suppose, we can try to theorize or think on the idea of what will be necessary, of how our troops will be behaving, how our unit mates will feel, how the dice rolls are going to go. There's no way of really knowing how the moral factor is going to play in, and that's the hard part of any of this, because the morale forces, of course, take their toll on the troops. You want to be a part of a winning side. If you're watching your unit mates or your fellow soldiers, in the case of history, if they're dying from cholera or suffering from typhoid, or they're missing limbs and they're in pain, they're hungry. You've got all sorts of things that can really take their toll on the morale of troops. Well, hopefully that's not happening within Bell. Nobody's getting typhoid, I hope. But this also takes its toll on the commander too, because most commanders are not inhuman. You don't find a whole lot of sociopaths that are able to work within a system like that. And so they still have to be around it. They're not so far removed that they are not experiencing this suffering and seeing the privation, especially in the case of these French commanders in the time period that we're dealing with. They're having to watch their troops starve. They're having to watch their troops go through some of the most deplorable conditions. And it's not like they don't feel for them. They see the fear. If you're commanding forces and you are around folks and they are afraid for their lives, how does that not stagger one's mind? How does that not put one on the back foot? And of course, the sacrifices that we ask people to make, especially within actual war, the sacrifices that are made. You think of Dunkirk, the evacuation at Dunkirk. Well, there was another fort. There was another group of soldiers who were basically used as a decoy. And they gave their lives willingly. And Churchill was still haunted by that decision. It was one of the most upsetting decisions that had to be made in that entire conflict, was using those folks being sacrificed. And that's not the one and only time. It's happened all throughout history. And commanders have to live with that knowledge. They have to live with themselves. And again, this in a much, much smaller way is true for us too, within what we do. In particular, when we're dealing with physical wargaming like Bellegarth. Our commanders still have to be around things. They're not around cholera, but they are around drama. There's the various even in a very well-functioning unit, there's still going to be minor disagreements or issues, political issues that spring up and can wear. If they're intense enough, or if a commander's not prepared for them, it can wear at the mind of a commander. Of course, weather, hunger, food, sleep deprivation, all these sorts of things can also take their toll. Again, not just on the troops, but on a commander themselves, on a leader for the field themselves. And a commander who is weak like this, and I don't mean weak like I don't mean it as a valued term, but commanders, again, need to be seen as having that strength of character, the clarity of thought, and the steadiness of mind. And if they are perceived to not be this way, then it can promote bad discipline, and it moves its way down the ranks. If you've got bad attitudes in your command staff, when we're dealing with the people in the games that we play, if there's bad attitudes at the top, that goes straight down the organization, right down to the troops. It can infect everything. Bad attitudes are team killers, and it promotes bad discipline, and it results in a loss of respect. Because unfortunately, in a lot of cases, a commander has to set themselves apart. They cannot seem as human as the people that they're leading. Even though that seems counterintuitive, that we would very much like our commanders to be that way. If you recall in the very first part, when you had the citizen army that had formed and was first marching forth from Paris and doing battle with the enemies of the Republic, You had some issues with discipline because folks were electing their own commanders, but then also arguing with those commanders because they felt like they should have a say anywhere because of liberty and everything there. And so because of this humanization, in a bit of as it was, there was a lack of respect. There was a lack of military discipline in that particular case. And so even though we don't have military structure for the most part in the games that we play, or actually in other wargaming you do. Like I know in a lot of paintball crews and that sort of thing, they have a far more structured environment to what they're doing there. But regardless, a commander has to be able to keep their wits about them and at least seem to be strong and clear of thought and steady of hand, because then they're going to get the most respect. They're going to get people who are more willing to follow them, regardless of if they actually feel strong or if they feel clear of mind. Fake it till you make it, right? So that's the hard part, right? That is the one that you imagine Washington at Valley Forge in the American Revolution, and the horror that he would have witnessed while there, the sheer humanity, just the profound suffering that occurred. But he came out of that being able to command. He was still of the right mind to be able to lead American forces toward victory. Instead of being crushed by the experience, instead of having his heart broken by the experience, he managed to continue leading folks who continued to see him as a beacon. Half the folks, thought he was leading them to their doom, and the other half of folks thought that he was some sort of savior. And of course, he was in between. He was just a man who experienced fears and doubts and concerns just like any other man. But that wasn't the point of being a leader. It's not about our issues as a leader. It's about tending to the needs of those around us. And when we stop to do that, it breaks down. It breaks down. Order breaks down. So that wraps that up for the most part. We kind of see how when we're making theory and we're bringing it all together, we need to make sure that we understand that there are certain moral factors that we just cannot understand. So we got to keep it loose. And so we're moving around. And so when we have a military force that is moving around, whether it be a unit on the battlefield or a small group of models moving around on a tabletop, where there is an assemblage of those armed forces. So we're going to kind of start going into the next section. And we're going to have an observation, which is what we're about to go into, and then 4 things that proceed from said observation that will be explained in subsequent chapters, in subsequent episodes. But this observation that we're dealing with, by the mere assemblage of armed forces at a particular point, a battle becomes possible, but doesn't always take place. Okay, duh, right? Just because something could happen doesn't mean that it will happen. Now, this is kind of like a proof. There's a statement right here that you go, okay, yeah, that's absolutely true. And then we can build on that because we know that that part is at least true. Clausewitz says that even the possibility of combat, even the possibility of an encounter, should be regarded as reality. How many times in our readings have we found commanders that let their guard down because they simply regarded a possibility as that? They didn't necessarily consider it seriously, and then they were punished for it. So this possibility, anytime we have that possibility, it needs to be treated seriously. We need to be making sure that we watch that. And the first point that can be made about this is that possible combats are, on account of their result, to be looked upon as real ones. A combat that doesn't happen can still be a successful combat. So let's take a look here at some examples. First example is if we're chasing a fleeing enemy and they surrender simply because they know that they got. Well, that's a potential combat that was avoided simply because our forces were there exerting pressure. Another example would be occupying a province that deprives our enemy of means, that's not necessarily a direct conflict. We're not physically smashing into their army. But by occupying this area, we might be starving them. We might be taking away the objective that they're looking for. So these possible combats can be used to achieve victory, like even if no blood is drawn. And so, of course, there's the deterrent factor, right? Just because somebody has superior numbers, or they're in an excellent defensive position, or they're intimidating in some other fashion, well, that can make an army turn away from their objective. Boom. There's another win under possible combat conditions. Next, we have the fact that there's a twofold object of combat, and that object consists of either the indirect and the direct, and how they relate to one another. Our direct object in combat, of course, or in strategy, is to bring our enemy to battle, right? To fight them and to beat them. The indirect object is any activity that is not combat that leads to an advantage. So as we were talking about before, occupying a province that at once deprives our opponent of, points or field control or food or whatever, depending on the situation, that in of itself does not beat our opponent, but it does lead to a distinct advantage for ourselves. And the same can be said for any other sort of again, indirect activity that pushes. Intimidation is a great one. It's absolutely a great one. Positioning is fantastic. So like a lot of these things can be used to bring it in, to dial it in towards the idea of victory, which is the whole point of combat. Now he lists this idea of examples, and in his example there's some more references to Napoleon. We haven't quite gotten there in our stories yet, and so suffice to say that the example that we look at are like what we're doing in part 3. We're looking for these possible situations and how combat and the lack of combat influence a campaign, influence a strategy. When this view is not taken, when we are not looking at the field as a bunch of potential combats and taking those potential combats not only seriously, but also as opportunities to improve our situation and by chance take away advantages from our enemy, this is the good way to look at it. And if we don't, we are perhaps giving value to other things. We're giving value to things that do not deserve it, things that don't, that's false. It's false value. Because we need to look at the whole series of events, right? There's a lot that goes in toward a victory, is what we've been saying this whole time. There's the combats, and then there's the things that go around the combats, the political issues, the food, the equipment. There's so much that goes into a victory. And one of the mistakes that and I'll freely admit it, one of the mistakes that we made in the earlier episodes here is that we focused on single combats. We look at the Battle of the Bulge, for instance, or at some of Zhuge Liang's tactics, and use them in an isolated sort of situation, and maybe give a little bit of background. We definitely give a little bit of background, but not nearly as much as I now see is necessary. I'm really glad we did that extended study of the Soviets, because it really gave me a clearer idea of the best way to give these examples, because it is so hard to see how these victories were pulled off without knowing how and the behind-the-scenes stuff that was taking place. And so we've, of course, changed our format now, and we're studying these things as a whole series of events. But that's also something that a lot of people make a mistake of. Not just us. The idea of looking back and saying, I'm going to study Marlborough's strategy, in this particular battle. And not understanding the rest of the circumstances in which the campaign occurred. The personal issues that were going on, the issues in the army that were occurring, none of this would be taken into account if we look simply at the battle itself. Looking simply at the battle of themselves, a lot of times things should end up differently. We look at it and we say, well, because X, Y, and Z, it should have ended up this way, but it didn't. We judge theory based on the final result. So, seeing that progression helps us understand how to get there ourselves. Helps us understand the steps that might be taken to mimic or improve on a particular winning scenario. And we have to understand, too, that we are not acting alone here. We are, of course, trying to better ourselves. We are, of course, trying to make sure that we are in a position to have the most advantages that we possibly can and undermine our opponent's ability to respond. However, we need to understand that they're doing the same thing. So there's always the counter to that. We need to be watching them while we're trying to do it ourselves, because these advantages are just as important as the battle itself, if not more so. If not more important than the battle. Because they feed into it. So strategy is all of this, right? Strategy incorporates the combats and the possible combats. It incorporates the actual engagement with our enemy, with the actions that we take to deter our enemy from said engagement and maneuver and manipulate them into a position that is good for us. Because these means and the forms of strategy are very simple. All of these concepts are very simple. But if they were easy to put into place, we wouldn't need all these big books. We wouldn't need this show. Because the application, the difficulty, is in the execution, right? And if we don't have these certain frames of mind, these certain traits as a commander, it can really make it difficult, especially to hold up against the different slings and misfortunes that we come up against in any real situation. And then, of course, we have the idea of making sure that we enter into this seriously, that we consider any possible combat, any possible complication as being legitimate and to be treated as reality, if only so that we can use it to our advantage. So, coming up to discuss these ideas with me, the morale and the force that it takes, the influence of morale over an army and over a commander, and these various observations we've had over possibilities and efficiency, we are joined by a longtime friend of the show, Juniper. Joining me here today to discuss these ideas of general strategy and taking simple concepts and trying to make them as easy as possible is a good friend of mine and longtime friend of the show, Juniper. How are you tonight, Juniper?
I am fantastic. Thanks for having me back.
I'm glad to have you back. I'm glad we finally got to recording, because you and I have been sitting here making each other giggle for about the past 3 hours. So
It's been a while, yeah.
But yeah, let's talk about these ideas. So you've been involved in multiple units, or in the one unit, but at multiple levels, and also within like realm politics. Mm-hmm. And so you know quite a bit, I would imagine, over the idea of simple concepts not being easy. For instance, when you deal with actual people.
Right. Absolutely. There's no such thing as simple.
No. Mm-mm. No, they don't make it.
No. Simple ideas, yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what Clausewitz is saying about military science in this section, is he says, none of this stuff is beyond us. Right. Right? An oblique, anybody can do an oblique. Obliques are cool. They do a thing, but you're not a genius if you pull off an oblique, right? Alexander did an oblique. Frederick did an oblique. But the getting that to go to the victory, right? Making sure that contributes and it's efficient and everything there, that's the part that's hard. Mm-hmm. And so again, running a realm, pretty easy. You help people get along. You make sure that your numbers end in the black at the end of your tenure.
Right.
And yeah, if nobody gets hit or dies or whatever, like you've had a
success.
Success, right? Easy or simple in thought. Mm-hmm. Hard.
Yes, hard to do. It's like painting. You can picture the painting in your head, but actually doing it, is different.
Oh yeah, I can picture a Monet in my head. Mm-hmm. I can paint myself a mad Cocapelli stick figure. Oh yeah. Third grade all over again.
That's about the level of my drawing skills, so it's okay.
But you're making an excellent point, though, where it's an idea of like conceptualizing is one thing, but having the skill and the training to pull it off. Again, you're not a painter. Well, you are a painter, but not
like that.
Not like that. I'm not even any sort of painter. I painted this room.
I was gonna say.
But it's not like this is going on any like cover of a magazine, or this isn't going to be on display in the Met. Which is,
It could.
This is modern art. But no, like I said, you're absolutely correct. This whole idea of it's a fairly
It is a simple.
it's a simple concept to explain, but it's not exactly easy to truly
Execution
understand.
is much different. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's you bring up the execution, and let's think about the Urukai for a second. In the early Urukai, like when I was involved, it was pretty cool. And one of the things that I loved, that it seemed like most people were not as a fan of, was like the formations. The marching and learning the drills, basically the drills of moving together and learning the commands. And even though some people chaffed at it, it was one of those things where it really worked. In those early years, that was part of what kept the Urukai in the formation. That made their victories, because that was the way that y'all worked.
Yeah.
And so, but how that idea was easy. But getting it to work out, like, let's talk about the process there, like making that work on the field.
You talk about it beforehand. You have to get the buy-in from the people that are in the unit. It starts with the leadership. They discuss it, or whatever. Somebody brings it to the leadership. You discuss it. It sounds like a good idea. Everybody gets to whatever degree they're going to buy in. They buy into it, and then you hypothetically put it into practice. But it's there's discussion and debate and that kind of stuff that has to go beforehand, and then there's the mistakes that are made on the field when people are trying to learn that stuff. And,
Sure.
Yeah, it is a totally simple idea, but the application is much different. It takes practice. It takes effort. It takes investment. Yeah.
And it takes, there were some flaws that were exposed too.
There have never been flaws in the Urukai. You take that back right now.
My apologies. It's a perfect unit with a perfect shield
That's
wall
right.
that cannot be breached. But it did have some flaws. For instance, it didn't respond well to multiple threats on multiple sides if it needed to move out of a place. And once it was committed to something, trying to uncommit it to that action was difficult.
Yes.
So there are still obviously things that need to be learned in order to make that more flexible, in order to make it into a more functional theory. In a previous episode, we discussed criticism and how it's supposed to shape. Did criticism come into it? Were there adjustments to this plan, or was it just taught the same way until everybody else caught on?
No, there were definitely adjustments, because you also have to take into account the strong suits and the abilities of your fighters too, because you have some people that are great in a shield wall and not great out on like one-on-one kind of thing.
Sure.
And then you have other people that are really quick and great at running around and assassinating people. So you have to make a tactic that works for everybody.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you got a whole unit of flankers to say everybody work as a shield wall. A lot of us in the West chafe at that, and I think a lot of realms have honestly switched toward that. There's a few of the diehard ones in the Midwest that still really focus on shield wall fighting, but I feel like a lot of realms have switched over to skirmish tactics.
Yeah.
Because they're efficient. You're committing exactly as much as you need to in any given space.
Well, it depends on the type of battle that you're fighting too, because you don't always need a shield wall.
True.
It's not going to work on a bridge battle. Well, not really, no.
I don't know. I think that would be the place for it to work.
You're not going to get a shield wall, though. You're going to get 2 people, maybe, on our bridge battles anyways.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of the last one I was at Aukfest, where you could stand like 5 abreast.
Oh, yeah, see, I haven't seen that one.
That was cool. That was cool. I didn't want to be anywhere near the front, because at that point, Reds are coming straight down. I like the idea of bridge battles.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to be in them. I watch them.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But even then, you have to take into account the people who fight with like sword and board and the people who fight with reds. Because if you're only doing shield wall stuff, you're not taking into account your archers, your red fighters, Yeah.
Which are all huge probability shifters. Yeah. So one of the other things that old Urukai army may have struggled with a little bit was the idea of doing just enough. Because when that Urukai army hit something, it hit them like a freight train. It didn't matter if it was a big unit. It didn't matter if it was a smaller unit. It was just hit with the same freight train kind of force. even with the way that it was set up, would there have been a way to use a bit more of efficient force in that way, or was it just a massive train of doom?
It was a massive train of doom, yes, and I think that that kind of stuff could have been taught if that had been something that you have to be willing to put in that time investment.
Sure.
To because again, you have to get the investment from the people in the realm,
right,
or in the unit. You know, why are we doing it? Why are we doing it this way? Why are we changing? You know, and teaching an individual one thing is different than teaching an entire unit something too. So you might be able to explain it to the person and they get it, but it gets lost in translation in a big unit like that. So for us, I think it just wasn't worth the time investment, and everybody really enjoyed being a doom train.
And there's something to be said for a doom train.
It is fun.
Even if it's not efficient. It is
Yeah.
a doom train.
Yeah. I mean, I don't need the entire fly swatter for the fly, but I'm going to use it.
That's one strategy. Not the one that Clausewitz recommends, but it is one, the idea of just massive force to begin with. It's hard to break against that, though. Like, even if you are a larger force, even like just that sheer volume crashing in really does a lot in of itself.
It is a psychological warfare in and of itself. Yeah.
I imagine that it was also, most people, even if they had some sort of superiority, whether it was like movement or ranged weapons or whatever the case may be, would have hesitated to engage simply because of your size.
Yeah.
Or the ferocity, because a lot of times people were banging their shields and being very like animated about it. Which is to say, you probably won a lot more battles than you ever actually fought, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. There were a number of times that like, you know, there would be 4 teams on the field, or 4 units on the field, and the Urukai's out there and like, we don't know if we can maybe beat this other team. So we scare the team over here and they're like, oh God, and they run off and they go fight the other team and they whittle each other away. So that's a fight we didn't have to do. You guys, and we did it in the sense of we drove them to it. And yeah, they kind of, you know, helped whittle each other down for us, and then we rolled in and cleaned up.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's an indirect victory at that point. Like, even though those 2 units over there are fighting, those are people being lost that they won't be able to use when they fight you.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's the ideal strategy right there.
Doom Train wins again.
I do love the Doom Train. I did enjoy fighting in that shield wall. There's this very sense of power, especially because of that call and response system. If somebody calls out, turn right, everybody screams, turn right.
Yep.
Like, it was cool.
There is something really neat about that. The year that we all went out on the field as the Orcakai and did whale calls was ridiculous and fun.
I'm not sure if I was there for that.
It was a Chaos Wars.
I'm not sure if I was there.
I don't know if you were there for that, but yeah. Instead of doing the regular cries, we all went out and it was amazing and stupid.
It's a whole new level of psychological warfare. I mean, it's kind of like, I've noticed in the past that Horde will occasionally go out and just do funny stuff.
Yeah.
Like, to just do either like goofy or stupid or silly stuff, and it makes people drop their guard.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh, well, these guys, look at these people making orca noises, or look at these people who are spinning their swords, or whatever the case may be. We don't have to take them as seriously. Right. And that's a whole nother, because like intimidating people is also, but making them overconfident.
Oh, yeah.
To come forward and fight on your terms is nice, too.
Because, I mean, the Berserker's terrifying, but the giggling fool that's going to shank you in the back is pretty scary, too.
Very, yeah.
Yeah.
It's for totally different reasons. I didn't like the movie yet. I'm just putting that out there.
No, I didn't watch it. The new one.
I have seen the trailers, so I know what happens.
Well, I've seen the first one, so...
Oh.
I mean, I assume it's... Who knows?
I just mean to say that, like, the trailers nowadays, like, if you watch the trailer, you've seen the movie.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah. Or if you watch a trailer, you have no idea what the movie's about. Those are the ones I hate.
That's true, where it's just like a random series of images. And you're like, okay, I caught dragons and silverware and the letter 7.
7's a number.
Nope, not in this movie.
Oh my God.
That's right, you're intrigued now, aren't you?
But do I want to watch it?
Dun dun, the letter 7.
The letter 7. Sounds like a Sesame Street movie.
Oh Lord. But yeah, it's that same goofy stuff. It's that goofy stuff that makes them drop that ability, and they stop regarding it as a possibility. They've discounted your force and your military strength as being like, okay, this is not going to be a big deal. Meanwhile, they're not preparing for the fact that it's a fully functional unit with vets and people who have training and they're good with their weapons. And so you've got intimidation, and then you've got making people let their guard down. And both are very effective.
Yeah, they kind of go hand in hand sometimes. I mean, the right kind of intimidation, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, people... There have been a number of times, and there have been times where we have forgotten that a unit is on the field because they're a small unit, we don't need to worry about them. So we disregard them, and then we end up getting wiped out as, they run around our back and roll down the line.
Right.
That has definitely happened.
Well, yeah, it definitely happens to me too, and I think it's happened to everyone. We've all underestimated some scrappy, small unit of something.
Yep.
Much like everybody who goes up against my Gene Stealers the first time is like, these guys are going to be easy.
I'm like, they're tiny. They'll be easy to kill. No.
I mean, individually they are.
That's not what I wanted.
And then came the scream.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in terms of strategy, an event, we don't have the same thing of like a campaign or an overall, like, we're going to move from this place to this place and then capture this. It's not quite the same. Even though over the course of most events, you're working toward like either some sort of banner or overall award or prize or something along those lines. And so it does actually turn into a campaign at that point. There are a lot of things that happen there, though. Very, very disparate things that require energy. How do you make sure that because the archive won before by being able to engage in all the different levels.
Right.
How are you able to efficiently assign people in order to capitalize on all those different opportunities?
Planning. Lots and lots of planning, spreadsheets and stuff like that. We also, we would do things like we would get on a Facebook group or a Discord call or something like that, and we would discuss, how many people do we need to do volunteer shifts? How many people do we need to, run Herald stuff or whatever? And we would literally block them out into these spreadsheets and determine how many points we could earn that way. How can we maximize points? And we would rotate responsibilities to make sure that people would get time on the field as well as doing these other things. So It took a lot of planning on our part, actually.
But it worked out.
It did, yeah.
And that's very much what Clausewitz recommends too, is just making sure you go in with as much planned for as you can. Understanding that there's going to be things that go wonky.
Yeah.
Somebody might get sick. Or
not be able to show up last minute kind of thing. And so we did kind of have backup people planned for that too. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Contingencies. That's where it's at. But the overall plan was the same. Of course, you're reaching for that one goal. You're reaching for
the banner.
The banner in that particular case, and many of those things were not combat related, but they contributed to the overall victory.
Absolutely. Yes.
And there's a lot of things like that in 40K as well too. Like there's the actual fighting of the opponent's army and trying to whittle them down. But especially in this new edition, the objectives are more important in this particular case. And so in getting those objectives, while they are not specifically combat related, very physically, very much points wise, matter in contributing to the overall victory.
Yeah, and there's objectives, and then there's, what are the cards again?
The secondaries?
Yeah. Those are the ones that sometimes when we play the different game type, you can like pick your secondary objectives.
Yep.
Yeah. I was just making sure I had the right term, but it's, there are definitely some of those that are not combat related, but do lead towards the whole overall victory.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've got a couple in my arsenal, for instance, things that help, like a speed boost to some of my bikers. It's not directly combat related. I'm not doing damage to your army, but by maneuvering those bikers behind you and getting my crossfire on you, I've then contributed to the combat victory of my army, even though the move itself was not...
wasn't offensive.
Yeah, it wasn't a fight in of itself, Which is good. which is good.
Yeah. I mean, I find it offensive just because you're probably going to kill my guys, but...
We'll find out. And then the listeners will find out, too. I typically gab about my games on here to demonstrate a point.
I'm also garbage with strategy when it comes to Warhammer, so...
You approach Warhammer much like you approach poker.
Yes.
And you win.
I win at poker. Yeah, not so much Warhammer. Because I don't do what he recommends you do, what Clausewitz recommends you do. Is to like stay on target and keep that. I mean, sure, I have the overall mindset of obviously I want to win, but I am like the wind when it comes to, this is my plan for right now, and then 30 seconds later it's a totally different plan and I have no idea what I'm doing.
Well, I mean, that sort of misdirection, that sort of indecision, which plagues many of us. It's because we're not the genius that he speaks of sometimes. We may have one or two of the things that he talks about, but most of us do not have great strength of character, clarity of thought and perception, and a steadiness of mind. Like all three of those traits in one person, that's not common.
Right.
Our Fredericks, our Napoleons, they are not commonplace.
Thank God. Yeah.
Which is why we read books about them.
Right.
But even just having any of this, though, is good. And you even see it, like, this isn't even like an actual campaign, but throughout the course of a Warhammer game, that strength of character, that ability to be like, all right, I'm pushing ahead. I suffered some setbacks, or whatever the case may be, but I'm pushing ahead. I know my boldness will not disappear. The perception, being able to go, okay, I know where I need to go and how I need to get there, and what my opponent is doing, and kind of how to counter that. And of course, that steadiness, not getting upset, not getting like on tilt based on what is going on. And many of us can do one, maybe even two of those things.
Right.
But doing all three perfectly all the time?
Yeah, no, that's not my jam. I've lost many a Necrons to to my, changing of tactics constantly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, it's the balance, though, isn't it? Because, like, you have to be willing to change because, like, the situation does.
Yeah.
And being flexible means that you don't just walk right into a trap. But in the same idea, you do need to be, like, driven. So...
And maybe that's why I do better at poker, is I'm a money-driven person. We'll put money on our next Warhammer game. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. You want to play for keeps?
Oh my God, play for keeps? No.
It's like marbles, right?
These are expensive marbles.
They are very, very expensive marbles. Oh.
Like I would cry.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and some of these things, like that steadiness of mind and strength of character, when we're dealing with actual military history, would have been needed in such a higher degree because of not just the stress of being on the trail and, the weapons going off and that sort of thing, but for just the moral toll.
Absolutely.
That it takes, on a person when they are exposed to suffering, privation, fear, sacrifice of their people, that's hard to bear.
Yeah.
For long periods of time. Imagine Washington at Valley Forge and the horrific things that you read about that particular winter, and he kept it together.
That's what makes him such that icon.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he was a good commander, and then that fortitude is really what pushed the Americans to be able to achieve victory in that war.
Yeah.
But it was that strength of character.
Right.
In that commander who pushed for that. Which is all, but we don't have that same problem. Like,
yeah, no, I'll sacrifice a piece of plastic.
Right.
Yeah.
Or if we're in Bell, people might get wet and soggy if it's raining or something, or if it's cold, people might be uncomfortable. But people aren't going to be starving to death. They're not going to be like losing limbs or anything along those lines. We're not dealing with the plague.
Right. Well, okay.
Scratch it, reverse it. We're not dealing with cholera.
Yeah, be specific on your plagues, please.
Right. We have many now. We're dealing with cholera or typhus or anything along those lines, but we do still have discomforts that can come around. And again, as somebody who's been a part of a unit and a realm at various levels, that still has an effect.
Oh yeah, if you get somebody who they come to an event and they have brought their their tent with them and they forgot their tent poles, and now they have nowhere to sleep, you know, and they're just going to crash out by the fire and whatever, they're not going to sleep well. They're not going to be performing at, you know, peak performance tomorrow because they're tired and grumpy and whatever. But it's not to the same degree that certainly nothing Washington was, you know, worried about.
Right. Or you know, what these guys were experiencing in the 1790s parading around. Even if somebody does get a boo-boo, we have antiseptic, which they didn't have. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Even just that. But it still takes a toll, you know, like if especially since that's that one person's experience. So let's say that one person sleeps by the fire, they don't sleep well, you know, they're not fully in it at that point. Another person eats too much before the fight and has an upset stomach of some sort. There's a lot of different factors that play into whether or not a unit is going to perform well that particular day. And a lot of it comes down to the individual stuff, but on a commander themselves, on the leader themselves. Not only do these same, like, you know, if you're listening to the complaints, and I mean perfectly valid sometimes complaints of unit mates, it can distract.
Yes.
You know, it can get up in your head. And if our own morale starts to slip as a commander, you know, that's not good either.
No, that's not going to help anybody.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so if a commander, let's say that even aside from everything else, aside from a unit perhaps not sleeping well or being too cold or having some sort of drama break out within it, as the French army was absolutely dealing with in the the 1790s at that point, they were dealing with all this other stuff that was happening. It becomes even worse if the commander starts to participate.
Oh, yeah.
Or starts to, like, have their mood drop too, because, like in the case of Washington, he was far removed. You know, he put himself above and away, and so in some ways he could be seen, not like a divine figure, but like the inspiration in that way. He was just a man.
He was a bastion, though.
Yeah,
you know,
but he had to be that bastion of hope. Napoleon was the same way. The emperor, he inspired so much devotion. You know, they had a very similar, like the ideals of the revolution were something that inspired. But one of the things but sometimes what they would lack, and sometimes we lack, is that kind of focus that brings it all into a depth, and the focus on the self. And if the commander starts to degrade, right? If they start to be seen as slovenly or weak in many cases. That starts to promote bad discipline, because that starts to trickle down as well. And
you see that in Bellegarth a lot, because you very much lead by example there. So if your unit leaders get trashed the night before and they're hungover the next morning and they're not out on the field, they're not driving people to weapon check, like go get weapons checked or whatever, everybody else in the lower ranks are going to be like, meh.
Right.
Yeah.
Unless you've got like some really go-getter sergeant who's going to be on that. By and large, it's the upper echelon that gives orders to the middle guys, and they go down to the little ones. And like you said, if there's a bad motivation, or if there was like a disconnect, let's say, like I don't think this very much happened, but let's say there was some sort of political fallout between the leaders, and there was that stress there. Why, that would degrade the sanctity of that unit even more.
Yeah, absolutely.
It starts to split and then doesn't function as a whole, which is not what we're looking for either. And of course they lose respect too. Like if a person becomes, and this is not to say that we need to be false with one another in this community, but when it comes to being a commander on the field or off the field, there is a certain degree of what we're talking about here. And not to say that a person can't feel what they feel. But a leader is supposed to lead. They're the ones who are supposed to do the hard thing. Like,
I'm sure Washington had feelings.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
I mean, he wrote about it in his diary. He suffered.
But his men didn't know that.
No.
You know,
No. I mean, they knew he cared for them, but they didn't know how, like, conflicted it made him. And again, that had to be kept inside. But even aside from that, it's really just the bad attitude. For us, that's the really big killer. If you have commanders who have a bad attitude coming on the field, again, that spreads like wildfire.
Yeah, even if you have bad leadership in Bellegarth, that will spread through realms, and same thing.
Yeah. So we have to look for these same things. We have to try to have our strength of character. Of course, try to strive for some sort of integrity and maintain that accountability. But we also need to be able to see things and not be clouded by a bunch of other crap, you know, because there's a lot of stuff that that comes with it that you have to sift through to find the actual truth or what's useful to the situation. And it always helps to be steady too. Just kind of going over these traits, but like, you know, that one's hard.
That's my hard one. Yeah.
That's a hard one. Yeah. Because it's sometimes I think sports helps with this, or it really doesn't. One of the two. Because a lot of I feel about half the folks who come from any sort of athletic, sporty background, you just can't get in their head. Particularly competitive folks, like folks in soccer.
Right. Okay.
You know, there's so many different physical head games that are played there that if you're trying to get in that person's head or put them on tilt, a lot of times you can't, because they're just used to dealing with that kind of pressure.
Right.
And they don't let you. And then you, of course, have the exact opposite side of just the hotheads who are willing to engage with anything. Most of us fall in between.
Right.
On a spectrum in between. And it largely depends on the day, too.
I was going to say, yeah, a lot of us are on a pendulum.
If you come into it, if most people were to come into a fight or a match and they're well rested and they're getting along with their partner and or friends and or family, and they've eaten well and have been healthy and like all those other things, then it is much easier for them to take a win or a loss and just kind of maintain a nice steadiness of mind to it. But if we come into it and we didn't sleep well and we're hungry and we're quarreling with somebody or whatever the case may be and we're already compromised, that's when the steadiness of mind really is necessary.
Yeah. It is hard to do with Warhammer. I think. For me, anyways, you know?
Do you think it's harder for Warhammer than it would, like, it's harder for the intellectual wargaming than for the physical?
And it's not even... I guess it's not even that. It's more that when I'm at an event, I'm at the event. I'm sleeping at the event. Like, everything I'm doing is about the event. When it's Warhammer, I'm like, oh, I have work today, and then later on I'm going to play Warhammer. So everything else is taking precedent before the game. So if I didn't sleep well last night, tough, you know? I still have a game tonight. But if I'm at an event, that's what I'm doing.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a little bit more all-encompassing, I guess.
Well, and it talks, you're speaking very much to when Clausewitz is talking about the difference between the strain on our senses between tactics and strategy.
Yes.
You know, when you're right there, like when you're in the event and you're there on the field or dealing with people in a visceral, physical sense, it is easier to be swept up in the moment and do what needs to be done, right?
Yes.
Whereas if we're doing something like Warhammer, like you say, we have a lot longer to think about things.
See, and my thing is I always push it off. I'll worry about strategy later. I'll think about strategy later. I'll take a nap before I play, or, you know, like, I'll eat later. That kind of stuff. And then, you know, you don't actually follow up on that, which he also advises not to do, to not follow up on your other plans, but...
Sure. And again, a lot of the advice that he offers here is simple, but not easy.
Not easy. No, he would be very disappointed in me.
I'm pretty sure he would be disappointed in most of us.
He's Prussian. He'd be disappointed.
He's sassy.
He is sassy. I was kind of shocked.
Oh, well, Juniper, this has been absolutely lovely, and I'm sure that we're going to continue chatting after this. But we have reached our limit for the interview, and let me just say thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely, again. I love coming on here.
Well, you'll certainly be back.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure.
For the rest of us, let's jump right in to the wonderful happenings of 1793. '93 would prove to be one of those pivotal years that seems to have affected a large portion of world history. 1793 would begin with this defeat and treason of Dumouriez, if we remember from our last episode. Now, this defeat and treason greatly intensified the political situation in Paris. It was already hairy there. Remember that we had discussed that before, how the reforms of the revolutionaries were being ill-received in some ways, in some places, and that there was this constant infighting. There was no central organized party. You had a lot of different people who had a lot of different voices that were attempting to get something ironed out in very short time. And things were going by the wayside. And so, like, the political atmosphere was extreme already, but it was becoming increasingly dominated by extremists, by those who held more zealot views than their countrymen did. And this was also a dangerous time of year in general. All pre-industrial societies had to deal with the fact that spring and early summer were the most dangerous times for any regime because of the harvest issues. In late summer and autumn and in winter, you have the harvest seasons and then plenty of stores left over. But as we move into spring and into the early summer, before the harvests begin, in these times there was usually inflation of some sort. The price of grain would double, triple, quadruple. And there would always be threats or rumors, let's say, of food shortages. And so that's the time of year that we're already in. This is a pre-industrial country that has already been suffering with food issues. It's not like they've been flush this entire time. They've been struggling to feed their people. They've been struggling to feed their army. And so people were already stressed about that. Like, we don't have food, and it looks like we're going to get less. So Paris is bubbling over at this point. There's a whole lot that is not doing well there, but it isn't wholly dependent on the war. The situation in Paris is not something that one can point at the war and say, that is exactly what caused it. That's reductionist. Of course, there were other things at play. But the fact that the war was having such an effect proves the effect of foreign policy on a country as a whole. You have to meet with the acceptance. As an American, I have to harken back to the Vietnam War. And no slant against our soldiers who have served there, but our foreign policy grew to be condemned by our people. It became, because of the media for the most part and their accurate portrayal of a horrific conflict, the country turned against it. But the country wouldn't have cared so much about it if that foreign policy hadn't affected them. And the effect was, of course, through their media, through what they were viewing. The foreign policy that was at play during World War II in this country that made it so that rubber and food and steel were being rationed so that the war machine could be fed. That was real. That foreign policy was driven home. And nowadays, that's not as real for most of us. We stand with the people of the Ukraine who are experiencing this stuff firsthand, and how that foreign policy can absolutely affect. And that's affecting us here at home too. So this idea that a country is isolated from the rest of the world and from the activities of its armies is just not true. Just like when this army was first formed in 1792, this army of volunteers going forth, there was this great patriotic zeal. Everybody was super into it. But then there came the defeats. And there came the issues with the army, and then there came the fact that nobody wanted to volunteer again. And if you recall at the beginning of 1793, where they decided to do their mass conscription, it did not go well. But that showed the state of the country, that showed the state that the foreign policy had driven it. Because in 1792, if we remember that army of volunteers, those folks who stood up and they were there because they wanted to be. They were there because they believed fervently in the values of the revolution. That army managed to win victories that other ones would not have, simply because of that boldness of spirit. The fact that everybody was on board with this same ideological principle gave them power. They had numbers, they had spirit, and those two things count for a lot. But by 1793, that had bled away. Most people had gone home, and the early conscription efforts did not work well. And so it was a state of bad news. The National Assembly is getting nothing but bad news. For instance, they are engaged in war on 5 fronts. Of course, we have the Austrians, who have now pushed through Belgium, retaking their holdings in the Netherlands, and they are now onto French soil. The Prussians have driven them out of their holdings in the Rhineland, which were of huge psychological import in terms of propaganda and in terms of having that space, that buffer zone. The Spanish had advanced from the south all the way to the River Tet. And then, of course, you have their issues coming from within. You have the counter-revolutionaries that we had discussed, who were in the west. And then there was a federalist revolt across the country against what they considered Parisian radicals. There is an exaggerated, most likely, estimate that 2/3 of the country was in revolt. That's interesting, isn't it? You have a revolution that's supposed to be for the people and the entire country hates it. I think it's because of the infighting, if you want my unsolicited opinion. But this is a bad place to be. These leaders and the country that they're trying to create, this is a bad place to be. Or is it? Because this situation has given certain extremists exactly what they need to succeed. Remember that war is based in politics, and it is influenced by, absolutely, unequivocally influenced by politics. The same is true anywhere. If we look at wargaming, especially at the more social, communal war games, like the physical ones, SEA, Belagarth, we can see how important this is. But this transition, which began 4 years previous, was now complete. I want to read to you a statement that the National Assembly made concerning this. This was on the 23rd of August, 1793. From this moment, until that in which our enemies shall have been driven for the territory of the Republic, all Frenchmen are permanently requisitioned for terms of service in the army. The young men shall fight. The married men shall forge weapons and transport supplies. The women will make tents and clothes and serve in the hospitals. The children will make up old linen into lent. The old men will have themselves carried into the public squares to rouse the courage of fighting men, to preach unity of the Republic and hatred of kings. The public buildings shall be turned into barracks, the public squares into munitions factories. The earthen floors themselves will be treated with lye to extract the saltpeter. All firearms of suitable caliber shall be turned over to the troops. The interior shall be policed with shotguns and with cold steel. All saddle horses shall be seized for the cavalry. All draft horses not employed in cultivation will draw the artillery and supply wagons. They called this at the time levy en masse, which is a mass levy, right, as the name implies. But this was something else. What they were having here, what they had by mobilizing the entire country to the war effort, was one of the first instances of total war, the concept of total war, in which the entirety, the whole crux of a nation, churns on the war effort. As it shows here, nobody is spared it. It's not just the fighting, aged men who are being called up here like a levy en masse would have. It's the married men. It's the women, the children, the old men. Every square inch of the Republic being called up to war. Now this is a huge deal, because all wars excite popular notion. All wars make it so that people even turn on each other. There is no real eternal conflict between Japan and the United States, and yet there is still some perpetual racism that exists in the United States because of our conflict with Japan. There was a notable increase in hate crimes against those of Semitic descent after 9/11, when the humors of the nation turned against people from those regions. They were excited. Their humors were excited. Their hatred was excited. And the whole country wasn't necessarily that way, but the whole country was spared from the war effort. There were those of us who joined up afterwards. There were those of us who were excited to action, but the majority of the country, while at first waving their red, white, and blue and singing their country songs, calmed down. And this is because it was a normal war. It was a war that allowed the people, that allowed America to settle back in to normal. Total war is different. total war consumes everything. The social sphere, the economic sphere, what they were talking about, what the National Convention had agreed here, changed the face of the entire country, and this is exactly what they wanted. If you remember back a couple of episodes ago, there were certain extremists within the National Convention that had pushed for this a long time ago, 4 years previous. And it had taken a while. It had taken a while for it to actually be realized as something that was tenable, as something that could be accepted / forced upon the population. There are other examples of total war in our history to demonstrate the terror that can come out of these things. There was a particularly evil man who once addressed the German public, and he used the words, "Wollet ihr den totalen Krieg?" My German is awful, by the way. "Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?" which means, do you want total war? The man was Goebbels, and he was addressing the Nazis, and they cheered for it. Thunderous applause within the chamber for this concept of transforming the industry, transforming the very fabric of society in the country to the aim of military success. There's games out. I know there's some games that are like medieval Total War and that sort of thing. And I think like the Fog of War, they take a cool concept and they make something fun out of it. But the reality of total war is very, very, very oppressive. And at the time that this was decreed, it seemed like the Republic was doomed. Either from the external threats, remember that they had the Austrians pushing down from the north, the Prussians in from the east, the Spanish coming up from the south, and then of course they had just about every person in the country up in revolt against their revolt, revolting against the revolt, counter-revolt. So the Republic seems doomed at this point. Part of what saves it is this transition to revolutionary war, is this transition to utilizing the entire country as a battery for the war machine. And part of bringing it to this place, part of making this revolutionary war, this revolutionary army a reality, was the newly created Committee of Public Safety. Committee of Public Safety. Well, that sounds nice, doesn't it? Do they deal with puppies, child-proofing homes, public safety, perhaps even policemen, cops, firefighters? No, instead this Committee of Public Safety was a direct campaign against enemies of the revolution. That would be the safety they refer to. Keeping the public safe from the enemies of the revolution. And the reason they were able to gain foothold was everything we've discussed previously. This committee would not have been formed in the early days of the revolution. It would not have been tolerated, partially because there were so many dissenting voices that would have existed within the National Committee itself. But those voices had long ago been silenced. All throughout this time, all throughout 1792 and 1793, the extremists were gaining ground. Oftentimes, it's the extremists who speak the most fervently, the most passionately, and in the way that inspire those who are downtrodden. Think about Hitler. The man could speak. The man could stand up and bring in the attention of an entire nation. He was an evil man, and he used that attention for evil aims to moralize something, which I know we're not supposed to do on the show, but I think we can agree that Nazis bad. But he was able to attain that prominence in some fashion because of his speaking ability, because of his ability to reach in there, but it was also extreme. It spoke to the extreme feelings that were occurring in the German public, and that was happening here too. There were moderates. There were people who wanted peace with the rest of Europe. There were people who wanted a constitutional monarchy. Democracy, there were all sorts of folks that were pushing for various ideas, but slowly they were being edged out. When we first started this section, we talked about how the National Committee's headquarters, that massive aerodrome that they apportioned after Versailles and Paris became theirs. And it very quickly went from some sort of hall, a serious discussion hall, to a circus. A place where the political pageantry ruled. It wasn't about the matter of debate, it was a matter of how it was debated. The substance didn't necessarily matter as long as the passion was there. And those are the folks that got support. And the more that the revolution was pressed upon, the more that their enemies won victories, the more people in the countryside rebelled. This hardened the hearts of the revolutionaries and made it so that the extremists could take over. Because the extremists were the only ones who were speaking to the degree in which people felt. It was emotional reasoning. So by degrees, we transition from something that had very liberal ideas, that had an idea of freeing society from the shackles of the monarchy and promoting people to live their lives, but to have this idea of a secular government, division of powers, all this sort of thing was very nice. But here we are, in August of 1793, with a very, very, very different political situation because of the losses. The terror, you would think, the term, the terror, would be some sort of yellow page journalism. Some critic from America or the UK printing about the terror, the awful things that were happening within revolutionary France at the time to try to discredit it, right? No, that name was used by the National Convention themselves. It wasn't an insult from the opponents, but the, quote, order of the day, September the 5th, National Convention. Terror, using terror as a state policy. And at this point, pluralism is gone. We no longer have people sitting down at tables to discuss different opinions. At this point, different opinions bad. The only opinion worth having was that of the revolutionary state. And so what we have now is a revolutionary state dictatorship, which has really become everything that it hated. You had the monarchy, an entrenched system that didn't listen to the will of the people, didn't serve the will of the people, being replaced by a dictatorship that's not listened to. It doesn't take into account the will of the people. It's funny how that happens. So this committee was there to try to mitigate the things of before, to try to foresee issues before they occurred. Robespierre, by the way, was a member of this committee. And it was to prevent things like Dumouriez or Lafayette, generals who had been, who a lot of trust had been put into, who ended up betraying the cause. In the case of Dumouriez, he almost got on his plan toward convincing the army to defect with him. Both of these guys did, Lafayette and Dumouriez. Both of them tried to get the army to defect with them, or at least parts, the artillery or the cav or whatever the case may be. And so this was a serious danger, right? You have all these troops, and every single one of them counts toward this war effort. But you have these commanders, these separate commanders that are, a huge security risk. So they say no central commander. We're not going to deal with this anymore. We're not going to deal with a Lafayette-Dumouriez situation. We've already had too much of this over the past year. And so instead, Lazare Carnot is elected to the Committee of Public Safety, a politician. And his job is going to be to kind of run this from the center, because there still does need to be a single controlling will at the center. We can't just have these disparate armies working on their own. Because that was part of the problem before. You had Dumouriez that was largely running uncontested in the north and doing his thing, and then there were the folks in the west and the east, and they didn't necessarily communicate. Again, these revolutionary ideals of equality, without having this strata, without having this military hierarchy, which is necessary for the conduct of a war. And so they developed these different armies, right? These holding armies in the Pyrenees, the Alps, and the Rhine to make sure that their enemies could not advance further, and then planned, much like the previous plan, was to strike north. This was for a number of reasons. You might wonder, Why did they come up with the exact same plan? Wouldn't that be predictable? They struck north the first time, failed, struck north again, did better, then fell back. And they're going to strike north again. Surprise, surprise. But do they really have any other choice? If they're going to try to conquer land, free more people, then they need to get more land. And if they move to the west, there's the English Channel, and then England, which is not necessarily the way that they want to go. But they go to the south, well, they've got Spain, but that's about it. Spain and Portugal is what you're going to find down there. Moving directly to the east, you run into the Alps, in which case if you slide south into the Sardinia-Piedmont region, you have a massive choke point right there. Unless you decide to Hannibal that particular situation, which is far less effective when you have the kind of surveillance that they would have at this time. Wouldn't have worked as well as it did in the Punic Wars. So the only place to go, really, is to the north. That's where all the good stuff is. That's where the Dutch Republic is. It's where the very rich resources of the Rhineland are, kind of the northeast there. So of course they go to the north. So this is a very different France than we were seeing in the beginning. And this is as we're getting into the Terror. And for those of us who are not necessarily super read up on history, the Terror is that time in France that is famous. When you have all the beheadings, all the different royal people, all the dissenting opinions, everyone getting up there to the stake. Even people from the same party as it goes on. Like it gets ferocious and it gets brutal. The state did not benefit from this. Nobody benefits from a so-called witch hunt. And so we see this, well, I would call it a degeneration. But of course the revolutionists, or the revolutionaries that wanted this total war situation, they would call it an improvement. Perfect, in fact. Played right into their hands, really. And that, it gave me chills, that little reading that we had, the statement from the National Convention. Reading that gave me chills. Because that kind of dedication to a cause, well, that's dangerous. But this would mean a lot of different things. This was huge. They had that conscription of 500,000 after this, that levy en masse that they couldn't do before. Well, you got a total war situation now. Everybody is already dedicated to the war effort. Was there resistance? Sure. Was that resistance put down with shotguns and with cold steel? Yes, it was. So the state dictatorship already sets the stage for the future. In only a few short years, we're going to see an emperor come onto the scenes. And that emperor could not have existed without this framework having existed, which was then, of course, propped up by the fact that there was no existing framework to begin with. The stresses of the five-front war. The fledgling republic was not prepared to deal with that. So it became something very different. Something that was very much against what it was in the beginning. And in doing all of this, it demonstrated some of the pitfalls that we covered in our first section. We can see here that all the fine thoughts in the world, all the revolutionary ideals that sounded fantastic in the world, do not matter if their final result isn't successful. And the difficulty lies in execution. Again, these ideals are fantastic. This perfect society that they're wanting to build is a very simple idea, but difficult to execute. And in all of this, of course, we see them turning away from logic in many cases, and that's what leads to this dissolution. But to build it back up, they have to understand, and they begin to understand, once again, this idea of possible combats. The combats that are fought and the combats that are simply implied. And we're going to see a very different story moving forwards, because these actions, as controversial as they may be, save France from the various enemies at this time. Perhaps not from itself, but that's a story for a different time. That's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't had enough of the art of wargaming in your life, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, where I occasionally post funny and educational memes. If you want to get in touch with the show directly, you can email us at artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com with any questions, comments, or concerns that you might have. Also be sure to check out all of our sister shows on the Earworm Network, including General Nerdery, Word Balloons, Fried Squirms, and more. We're working hard on having something for everyone. And again, you can find those at earworm.com. That's EARVVYRM. You can also find that in the show notes. But for now, this has been Yaga Malark, signing off.